Each panelist will have 10 minutes to make introductory remarks, followed by 3 minutes each to respond to each other, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and I'll be taking one question at a time.
All right, I apologize if my introduction is incoherent in any manner. This is a very broad question, and I think there's a lot of different angles to take it from, so I wanted to approach it in a broad sense. But first off, I just wanted to start by thanking all of the organizers of this event, my co-panelists, and Left Forum in general. While I don't think it's an ideal space for socialist political education, the existence of a quasi-convention of leftist intellectual thought is better than its complete absence. Also, before interrogating the premise of this gathering, I want to establish that there are many organizers within the DSA and in other leftist organizations that are more intensively committing their labor to building the internationalist socialist movement than myself, many of whom are literally putting their lives on the line in both anti-fascist struggles and in direct confrontations with the imperialist capitalist state. Heather Heyer and Mario Franco are just two of the many martyrs of the global class war whose sacrifices we can't forget. Lastly, I want to recognize all the quote-unquote invisible labor primarily done by women and people of color in our society in general, but also within the DSA. If we want to change the world, we must also recognize our own complicity in reinforcing the oppressive hierarchies that emerged from a tyranny of an exchange value determined by an oligarchy largely composed of white men from the imperialist core. Recognizing this reality is not based in the shallow corporate pseudo-feminism and token multicultural politics of neoliberal hucksters in the Democratic Party, but rather is grounded in a materialist analysis of the historical development of gendered and racialized divisions of labor and the reciprocal relationship with the formulation of ideological hegemony. Men, especially white ones, in socialist organizations must be rigorous in our own self-criticism, as well as recognize a responsibility to help shoulder the burden of administrative work. It's exciting to share your inspiring vision for socialist liberation, but much of the work essential to build a mass movement of the organized working class will be boring and tedious. If good ideas were enough to smash the capitalist state and bring about the proletarian revolution, the left would have won decades ago. Yet here we are. It's been over 100 years since the dissension of the competing European imperialist capitalist states into barbarism-triggered revolutions across the globe. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Lenin's hope would come to fruition, as workers, sailors, and soldiers rebelled against the First World War and the governments perpetuating that unprecedented slaughter. It appeared as if the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was spreading across Europe. The old regimes of the defeated powers were shattered. Even Italy, aligned with the victorious Entente, was brought to its knees by waves of general strikes. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the triumph of the proletariat looked as if it were on the horizon. However, for numerous reasons that we don't have nearly enough time to discuss, the worldwide socialist revolution did not come to pass. In fact, the age of catastrophe had only just begun. The first cataclysm of capitalism culminated not in proletariat revolution, but in the rise of fascism, the most violent counter-revolutionary force in history, which unleashed a genocidal war of premeditated extermination unparalleled in history. Soviet Russia, isolated and devastated from years of war, famine, revolution, and more war and famine, became increasingly fixated on its own survival rather than bringing about a worldwide communist revolution. Yet that doesn't mean the Russian Revolution was in vain. It made popular the possible Popular Front alliance that defeated Nazi Germany, provided a model of revolutionary strategy that inspired numerous anti-imperialist struggles throughout the 20th century, as well as enabled the rise of social democracy in the capitalist core that led to the higher standards of living in human history. Despite these advancements, the structural power of the capitalist ruling class was further entrenched, and its social Darwinian rationalization of hierarchical domination was never excised from an international system fundamentally constructed upon exploitation and appropriation. The overthrow of radical reformers in the developing world, the collapse of the Keynesian consensus in the wealthiest liberal democracies, alongside the dissolution of the nominally anti-capitalist Soviet Union, has ushered in a new era of plutocratic politics. It's no longer 1917, but another cataclysm appears to be on the horizon. Real scarcity has been replaced by artificial scarcity, a world in which 5 men own nearly as much wealth as the poorest 3.7 billion people on Earth. Human civilization is yet again teetering on the edge of widespread catastrophe. Without radical transformation, climate change will reverse the meager gains of the global south within the next couple of decades before ushering in an apocalyptic hellscape all across the Earth. The inevitable resource scarcity of worldwide ecological catastrophe only increases the likelihood of immensely violent conflicts, an already occurring phenomenon exemplified by the devastating drought that exacerbated tensions in Syria, leading to a brutal civil war. All while the existential threat of nuclear annihilation caused by either reckless politicians or human error remains an ever-present danger. Can the socialist left meet this challenge? The collective faith in the illusion of a free society that holds together the contradictory liberal political values with an authoritarian economic structure is vanishing before our very eyes. This is what led to my own political development. I am not in the background of someone you would expect to engage in socialism. I grew up in Westchester in a wealthy family that worked in finance. But I was raised on these broad liberal egalitarian concepts. But the reality of the world shattered that one by one with the Iraq War, the financial crash, the disappointment with Obama, and then through the Bernie campaign and the Trump election, I was radicalized. And then within joining DSA, I've become further radicalized and come to an understanding that engaging in electoral work is not enough to bring about socialism. There have been a number of broad left developments since the financial crash that I think have both led to a transformation in the left and specifically DSA. Prior to Occupy, DSA was a small organization that was mostly composed of leftovers from the New Left in the 1960s. Occupy brought in a new energy to DSA that led to the ultimate transformation that came after the 2016 Bernie campaign. Amidst this transformation, there's also been a growing unionization within young people in particular in media, graduate students. Like, for example, even though it's at an elite Ivy League institution, the 5,000 Harvard faculty that recently organized and were guaranteed a contract. Even in fields like transportation, there has been a recent upsurge, such as the 5,000 JetBlue workers that recently joined a union earlier this year, as well as a victory in South Carolina, the most virulently anti-union state in the country, in which approximately 250 workers this past week decided to unionize. Alongside this, there has been an emergence of strikes across the country. Most well-known are the teacher and other educational workers, starting in Chicago in 2012, and then this year spreading to West Virginia, Jersey City, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Arizona, Colorado, as well as threats in Pittsburgh and LA, not among the teachers, but among the other public education workers that forced the hand of the state. As alongside this, graduate students at Columbia, the University of Illinois, and the New School have gone on strike. And in the New School, this also contained solidarity with the cafeteria workers who, with the students, have occupied the cafeteria, demanding a worker cooperative in its place. This has also coincided with the growth of explicitly socialist media, as in Jacobin. What I've been doing personally in DSA is working in political education. I was part of the Central Brooklyn branch working group that recently put together a night school that met over 8 sessions and discussed both classical texts such as Marx, but also dived into more recent phenomenon through like the lens of academic scholars like David Harvey. At the same time, I've been a rank and file member of electoral campaigns such as Jabari Brisport's effort, which was the most successful third-party effort in a New York City Council election in at least a decade. What's also happening in political education is we're developing the second round of night schools, as well as starting to begin a internal debate forum. 1 minute? Okay. So where is DSA going? I think this is an impossible question to answer. I reject the premise, though, that it's like going nowhere. I think there are endless possibilities. I think there's too much of a focus on the left, as there has been for a long time, on specific questions of whether we should support the Democratic Party, align with social democrats, work with union bureaucrats. I think the real question here is organizational structure, is whether there are going to be decisions that have to be made in moments, whether to work with specific social democrats or not. But the real question is, what is the organizational structure? Can DSA, through a broad democratic structure and a leadership that is accountable to democracy, be further radicalized in its engagements in struggle? And I hope to discuss this.
Sorry, I didn't mean to make the timer go off out loud. Jim?
I should say that I approach this as an observer rather than as a member or activist of DSA or any other organization. Pre-Socratic philosophy was dominated by two figures with diametrically opposed principles. Parmenides, on the one hand, posited a static, unchanging one. His opposite number, Heraclitus, posited a universe that was in eternal flux and to which no definitions could be fixed. Now, until until 2016 and 17, the U.S. far left, at least that part of it in New York, which I was active in, bore much more of a resemblance to the Parmenidean universe in point of stasis, if not in unity. You're not in the wrong panel. I'm an old philosophy student. I can't resist these analogies. But all of the territory on the far left was very clearly demarcated. No one in one bailiwick was particularly interested in hearing what people in other bailiwicks had to say. They had heard it all before. And this equation changed quite dramatically as a result of the influx of 24,000 new members into Democratic Socialists of America as a result of the Bernie Sanders campaign for the most part. So, to ask where the DSA is going, and if I don't have time to complete this in my allotted 10 minutes, I hope to do so in the discussion. To find out where that's going, we have to interrogate a little bit about what the old DSA was. So it was founded in 1982 from a merger between DSOC and, that is the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and the New American Movement. DSOC was dominated by Michael Harrington, and the New American Movement, in which I participated before the merger, was a rightward moving, I would say, remnants of the 1960s New Left. And it was inseparable, and the whole political identity of DSA is inseparable from the political career of Michael Harrington, who has achieved in social democratic circles, and further, a kind of saintly status. His picture still adorns the DSA website. So, what was Harrington, and what were his politics prior to the merger? He was, after a brief sojourn on the revolutionary left, became a leading member of the Socialist Party. He was the author of The Other America, an expose of U.S. poverty, a member of the Kennedy Poverty Commission, and he was, in left-wing politics, a member of the Socialist Party of Norman Thomas, and within that party, his tutor and mentor was someone whom some of you may have heard of called Max Shachtman. Shachtman was moving right at this time. The Socialist Party was completely on board with the Cold War anti-communist crusade. In fact, its head, Norman Thomas, took money directly from the CIA. So, it was in this capacity that Harrington was involved in the most famous episode of his early career, which was locking out Students for a Democratic Society, which was then under the tutelage of the LED, the League for LID, the League for Industrial Democracy, under the which was the educational arm of the Socialist Party. The SDS's Port Huron statement had raised objections, had made some criticisms of Cold War anti-communism. Worse still, it had admitted a member of the Communist Youth Group, but to its convention. And as a result of that, Harrington called the leaders of SDS for an inquisition before the board. He cut off their pay. He locked them out of this. They had crossed the line in violating the anti-communist credo of the Socialist Party. And the next major episode in Harrington's career was his involvement in the Vietnam War. He refused to call for the complete withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Vietnam until the pitifully late date of 1970. I needn't tell you everything that went on before then. But during the Vietnam War, prior to that, he was actively involved in red baiting the anti-war movement. His peace organization, which was called Negotiations Now, was a front for basically a front for Max Shachtman, who secretly favored the victory of U.S. forces in Vietnam. So it was, according to his biographer, nothing more than a platform from which to red bait the other organizers of the anti-war movement. So that was the 60s and early 70s. But by the 1980s, politics had changed, and the animosities of that period had somewhat cooled down, and the group of anti-communism had lost its hold on a lot of the population and even the left. So this is the time when the merger took place, and between NAM, the New American Movement, and DSOC, resulting in the creation of the DSA. But I would submit, and Harrington said at the time, that the merger took place essentially on his terms. Yes, it dropped some of them. He apologized for locking out SDS, etc., and for some of his more obnoxious Cold War interventions, but the two essential things, his project of realigning the Democratic Party into a progressive social democratic force, and his support for progressive trade union bureaucrats remains. Some of the three trade union bureaucrats that he did support, that he touted, were three who were probably bore the most responsibility for the historic defeats of the labor movement in the late 70s and early 80s. Victor Gottbaum, William Wimpesinger, and Douglas Fraser. We can go into that more later. Now, that was the DSA prior to the influx of members in 2016-17.
2 minutes.
Okay. And now we can say that the DSA has changed in a lot of ways. They show adherence to leftward. They show a lot of leftward motion. They have voted to leave the Second International, but they have adhered to the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, and therefore there is an evidence that this is an organization more in Heraclitean flux than in Parmenidean stasis. So we can't say exactly where it is going, but we can examine, I think, the politics of what is perhaps its flagship publication, the flagship publication of the DSA left, which is Jacobin magazine. And again, Jacobin magazine has all kinds of very left-wing contributors. It is also distances itself from the Cold War anti-communism of social democracy. It says that social democracy, that the welfare state isn't enough. It takes its distance from Harrington's view about realigning the Democratic Party. But recently, we have had what appears to be a couple of manifestos from two of its leading personalities. One is Bhaskar Sarkar, who wrote an article last summer in an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and Vivek Chibber, who is an academic who also edits the Catalyst magazine. And that they reaffirm their commitment to two very important things here. One is electoral reformism, working within the electoral system, and two is the market socialism. There is very little argumentation for this. I say it reflects a mood and a sensibility rather than a well thought out position, but it also represents, and I'll finish right here, it represents a refurbished, rebranded social democracy shorn of some of its more repellent characteristics. That is the closest thing we can come to ascertaining what the politics of the left wing of the DSA is.
Erin?
So my name's Erin Hagood. I'm an undergraduate at the University of Chicago and a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm not in the DSA, however, through Platypus, I've organized several panels with members of the Youth Democratic Socialists of America. I've been to their meetings. So this is going to be me kind of attempting to use my Platypus education and my education in Marxism to kind of examine the DSA as an object. And just to give some background, I wanted to read this Marx quote from a letter to Ruga he wrote in 1843. So he said, this is where he calls for the ruthless critique of everything existing, and he said, we shall simply show the world why it is struggling. And consciousness of this is a thing it must acquire, whether it wishes it or not. So today, I'd like us to consider why the DSA or to consider the DSA as a necessary form of appearance of freedom, and how we can kind of understand it that way or critique it that way. So a lot of common critiques of the DSA, besides critiques about their specific positions, focus on the fact that the DSA runs candidates in the Democratic Party, and I don't really actually want to focus on that. Most DSA members would respond that we shouldn't be categorically against a tactic like running candidates in the Democratic Party, and that is true, right? So what I would say is that, of course, if running candidates in the Democratic Party was able to get us the dictatorship of the proletariat, able to get us socialism, then they'd be absolutely right. So I think that in kind of examining the DSA, we actually have to take a different starting point. And so I want to talk about the DSA's goal, its strategy, and its tactics. So its goal is ostensibly socialism, democratic socialism. They're the Democratic Socialists of America. They've got Eugene Debs on their banner. And so that is kind of the metric by which I'm going to kind of be measuring these other things. And so mostly I wanted to talk about their strategy, which has kind of come up, actually. But it's on their website. They have a strategy page. You can read it or ask any DSA member. And it is to democratize everything. And that is kind of how they think about all of their different tactics and how they think about the struggle for socialism. So I wanted to talk a bit about democracy, right? What is democracy? And so I wanted to read a Lenin quote from State and Revolution. And so he says, democracy is a state which recognizes the subordination of the minority to the majority, i.e., an organization for the systematic use of force by one class against another, by one section of the population against another. Meaning that when we're talking about democracy, we are talking about subordination. The question is whom? Who is subordinating whom? Why is this subordination happening? For what purpose? So for example, Marxism sought to subordinate the middle class to the working class via the dictatorship of the proletariat, to subordinate the bourgeoisie to the working class via the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e., so the democracy, right, of the dictatorship of the proletariat is in kind of recognizing that subordination. And so what is the subordination that's happening in the DSA is kind of the question I wanted to pose. What interests are subordinated to other interests within the DSA? And I would argue that kind of one of the best ways for us to consider the DSA and its different tactics is through the Marxist concept of Bonapartism. And Bonapartism. Bonapartism. And so there's a couple of reasons for that. Mainly in that, and I'll give kind of my argument, and then we'll talk about the specifics. But that the DSA is attempting to organize middle-class discontents in capitalism. And this is what kind of the progressive realignment of the Democratic Party, progressive politics is. And so that what we get in the DSA is a series of competing interests that are ultimately subordinated to what the Democratic Party. But not because the DSA runs candidates in the Democratic Party. That's not the reason. So I wanted to, I want to talk a bit about progressivism and the history of progressivism. So I was asked to fill in for Chris Cutrone, who is a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, who is kind of going to be speaking on this panel. And he has an article called The Second Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age. And it's discontent, something along those lines. And in it, he talks about the split in liberalism between conservative liberals and progressive liberals. So conservative liberals say that the progressive capitalists will address discontent. So by supporting big business, you can get people jobs, this sort of thing. And then the difference between that and the progressive liberals is that the progressive liberals call for state policy to enforce this, right? Which to me, brings to mind the Marxist concept of Bonapartism. So that is after the 1848 revolution, it gets its name from Louis Bonaparte, who was a utopian socialist. He was a Saint-Simonian socialist who was elected to the Second Republic of France, and then he later had a coup and became kind of the popularly supported emperor for life. But what's really significant kind of about his regime is how these different interest rackets, for example, were kind of struggling for power to mediate the crisis of capitalism that was happening. And this is kind of similar to what the progressives want. They want state policy that enforces different sort of progressive policies by capitalists to kind of reform or otherwise rein in a crisis of capitalism. And so what Chris wrote is that the game is to capture middle-class discontents in progressive capitalist reform. And I would argue that this is kind of precisely what the DSA does for the Democratic Party. So both the Democrats and the Republicans in the wake of 2008 have a need to capture the middle-class discontents with the 2008 crisis that were expressed through lots of things. Occupy is a big one, but also Black Lives Matter, the anti-war movement, the list goes on and on. So when we talk about the tactics of the DSA, this is where things seem to get messy, right? Because, the first time I ever went to a YDSA meeting, what happened is pretty much what happens in any activist meeting, actually, is you sit down and somebody says, okay, what are the different sort of activities that we want to do? What do we want to support? What are our causes? You go around the room and everybody says their causes, and you get the usual suspects: climate change, anti-racism, the list goes on and on. And then, they're like, well, okay, we should do all of these things, but we can't do all of them, right? And so some get chosen and some don't. And I think this, is very apparent in a lot of kind of the fights that happen within the DSA. So for example, will DSA support Israel or will they support BDS, right? That was kind of a big question within the DSA, and some people were really excited when they said that they would support BDS. At the same time, you had, for example, the recent East Bay DSA election, where the same people who, were happy the DSA supported BDS thought that they elected really, conservative DSA members. So there's a question when it comes to Jacobin and when it comes to DSA, the DSA, of why is it that every leftist group thinks they can project their interests into the DSA? Because everybody can, right? We can look at Jacobin and we can say that they publish lots of like left progressive things. Or we can look at different parts of the DSA and say, well, they're doing this or that policy that I like, right? And I would argue that all of these are essentially different middle-class discontents with capitalism that are being organized by the DSA, and that this is a necessary process, as in for the Democratic Party to organize the middle-class discontents with capitalism, to capture the progressive imagination, you need an organization that is able to kind of deal with all of these different discontents and to be kind of the place where they can be heard and the place where they can either be worked on or thrown in the trash, right? Where you can kind of pick and choose where the different interests can fight with each other. For example, the BLM kind of social democrat divide within the DSA, I think, is a really big example of this. And so when it comes to the democracy of the DSA, this is precisely the problem. It's that they're the Bonapartists of the left. As in, any leftist organization can say, yes, this is the group where I can go after my interests. And maybe that's true. Maybe you can be an interest group in the DSA. The same way that, for example, many of my fellow students joined the DSA to, and I'm quoting a student here, participate in the Democratic Party realignment. Because it's easier to join the DSA to help support Bernie against Hillary than it is to like become a big wig in an NGO. It's an easier way to support the Democrats. So when it comes to the question of its growth and of socialism, this can be an opportunity for education, but it can also be an opportunity for miseducation. And so what I'd argue is that the DSA expresses a need for authority. So something that Lenin also says.
It's time to wrap up, Erin.
Okay, yeah, this is it. In State and Revolution is that, he's like, okay, well, we're not utopians. We do not dream of dispensing at once with all the administration, with all subordination. These anarchist dreams based upon the incomprehension of the tasks of the proletarian dictatorship are totally alien to Marxism, and as a matter of fact, serve only to postpone the socialist revolution until people are different. No, we want the socialist revolution with people as they are now, with people who cannot dispense with subordination, control, and foremen and accountants. The authority of the DSA is precisely in its democracy and precisely in its identification with the Democratic Party against Trump and the Republicans, with the kind of implicit assumption that the Democrats are the better ones and that, when they do well, at least we're doing better. And what I think that expresses is the necessity of forming a party that could actually instrumentalize our labor for creating the dictatorship of the proletariat and for creating socialism. And so maybe we can get into more of that later, but that's kind of my impression of the DSA.
Thank you. So now each of the panelists will have 3 minutes to respond, starting with Jack.
Well, there's certainly a lot to respond there. And I mean, I don't disagree with DSA being filled with a lot of formerly middle-class discontents. But I don't think we can also negate the fact that a lot of the people who are in DSA are former members of, yes, middle-class homes that had property based on a debt bubble that burst and is only going to get worse. So I don't think we should automatically discount people as, oh, they're still middle class because they grew up in a middle class background. People can become part of the proletariat. And I think to automatically dismiss people because of where they are now and not where they could go is a formation of politics that is based upon having always the right answer for eternity rather than using the right analysis to determine what is needed in the current moment. The DSA, the structure of the DSA, the democratic structure of it, and it's not simply a democratic structure, but it's also a structure that gives autonomy to working groups. There are elements in the DSA I think to use interest groups is, I think that's not the proper summation of the the makeup of DSA. A lot of people came into it without any prior activist organization, while other activists came in, yes, with a background. I think there's a lot of nuance in the manner in which DSA is organized and is moving further to the left. And I think also there's this notion that the Democratic Party is this like conspiratorial force that is directing people in this way or the other, while yes, the DSA has run candidates on the Democratic Party line with no assistance from the internal organizations within the Democratic Party. I think that is really important to note, but also has run candidates outside of the Democratic Party. Would forming a party organization other than the Democrats be a superior alternative? Yes, that's likely, but how is that going to happen? We have to meet people where they are. And if you say that, oh, I'm developing this third party, well, within the context of the U.S. electoral system, that is not really possible. The last time there was a real third party surge was prior to the Civil War, when there was an expansion into the Midwest. Like, we have to analyze the historical context that we're in. So, and at the same time, the notion... sorry.
You've got 5 more seconds.
Oh, I got 5.
If you want to.
Also, the fact is parties themselves are bourgeois institutions that are always going to compromise the needs of the state. The Communist Party in China is now probably the number one financier of global capitalism. So I don't think just formulating third parties is the solution. There has to be a counter-hegemonic strategy that builds alternative institutions, not just in electoral politics, but throughout the entire political economy.
Let me just say now a few perhaps unanticipated words in defense of DSA. I think this whole analogy of Bonapartism is a trifle strange. And in fact, I must say that as I have been reading Platypus, things written by Platypus and Catrone for a long time, I found them very difficult to understand, and what I do understand I find somewhat peculiar. But the fact that we have the fact that the discontents of the middle class are being voiced in DSA, I don't find that unusual at all. We've had for decades mainly a middle class left. It isn't that people at the DSA are aiming specifically at the middle class and its discontents. It's that these are the people who flock to the left. In the 60s, it was the middle class students and minorities, oppressed minorities who were rebelling. It did not, the left did not include the working class. Now, what I would say, and I don't know that this is the responsibility of DSA, it's an organization that welcomes who it can. It is an organization very much in flux. There are all kinds of forces there. It's kind of a halfway house now between its old pale pink social democratic self of yesteryear and maybe something else like a big tent, a big left-wing tent like SDS was in the 1960s, so that is why it is arousing so much interest. But I would say what is going on here among Jacobin and others is kind of pandering to a sensibility that it has spontaneously grown up among those young people who voted for Sanders, to a mood, and it is this. Instead of revolutions like the Chinese and Russian revolutions being looked to for a model, we have the New Deal. We have the vanishing welfare state. And the idea in most of these minds is that we are going to elect progressive politicians and we are going to pass legislation that will restore the Rooseveltian New Deal type of welfare state. But they simply accepted that illusion and that consciousness. They don't, without attempting to make any interrogation or criticism of it. And and that is what I call political opportunism. I think that if you are going to argue for that kind of thing, you're going to have to argue on the basis of what the current state of affairs under capitalism will allow, how far it will allow progressive politics to go, what the limitations are, and what the perspectives based on those limitations and possibilities are. I think that requires a serious theoretical appraisal. I don't think you have that yet in DSA, Jacobin, or any faction of it.
Thank you. Erin?
Yeah, so just to respond real quickly. So it's kind of funny because you brought up that you're from like some middle class background, but I'm not actually attacking that. Like, but it's kind of amusing to me that you think so. Because the reason that I'm saying that there are middle class interests in the DSA doesn't really have to do with anybody's background. It would be okay if it was just all like rich Westchester white boys. That would be fine. That would be awesome. If that can like make, just because that's what like people would say, it's not about you. If that would make socialism, I'm all for it, right? The question is ideology and politics. And the politics of the DSA, I would argue, and maybe we can get into this in the Q&A, are that of middle-class democratic discontents, right? Discontents with democracy. We want more democracy. We want to democratize. We want to fix climate change. So we should be, have the Paris Treaty. We need BDS. All of these different things. And then just to respond real quickly, I think that me calling the DSA Bonapartist is being really nice to the DSA. It's giving them a lot of credit, at least in my view, because that means that there is something there, that there is some sort of struggle going on, or that there is like even the desire to have like the authority of interest rackets. I don't know. So like maybe that's not there. Maybe the DSA is just, doesn't even show the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, is what I'm saying. Maybe it's not even a phenomenon of the necessity of freedom and capitalism. Because what the political party for the proletariat, like historically was sought to do was to lead the masses, to lead these different discontents by reappropriating capital via the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to make socialism. And I think that that need is expressed through kind of the way that all of these different interests can project themselves into the DSA, and through the DSA's kind of identification with the Democratic Party against Trump, is what I was saying. So it's kind of the question of, does the DSA suggest like the possibility of greater politics, not, is the DSA bad for being in the Democrats, which I think is more or less a banal point. Plenty of, I think, left groups accomplish just as little or less than the DSA and are independent of the Democrats, or they support democratic ideology anyway. But I do think this is about ideology and politics, and not, somebody's background.
Thank you. So now we're going to open it up for questions. Please keep your questions brief and to the point. I saw you first.
Okay. So I came a few years ago during the Left Forum conference. I came across the Platypus group, and I found your approach towards theory refreshing. I don't know why you still call yourself Marxist, if you do. And actually, that's a good thing, being so critical. And I attempted to find out more about the Platypus group. I went to some reading groups. And what I found frustrating about your group is you seem to disdain activist work profoundly. I don't know what you do. I have no clue. And I'm not interested in theories if they're disconnected from practice. Now, my question, why the Platypus group found it necessary to organize a panel asking the question, what is the DSA? Really, that's puzzling to me. And secondly, I haven't followed up the Platypus group for some time. Do you do any activist work? And that's a serious question. I'm not for mindless activism. I'm not for protest movements, personally. But if we are enclosed in a cocoon debating theoretical questions, we're not going nowhere. And the impression I get of the Platypus group, it's a bunch of college kids that in their majority, they haven't worked one single day in their life. So what can you talk about? You cannot talk about revolutionary politics and an organization. It's an oxymoron. And so why did you find it necessary to run the panel asking the question, what is the DSA? And what do you do yourselves at the organizational level?
Erin, would you like to take that or shall I?
Oh yeah, I can answer that.
I would
so-
add that I am a Platypus member and I have a
I know,
full-time
I know.
plus job. I've worked many days in my life.
I have also
Sure,
worked
but,
many days
you know,
of my
I
life.
mean, you know,
Why don't we let Erin answer you?
So, in terms of the question of like activism, because what I would say is that just because somebody is like action is happening, doesn't really mean much in terms of the ultimate goal in itself, right? We can have lots of activists on the street, and in fact we do. We have lots of people going to protests. Are we any closer to socialism? I'd say no. And you know, Platypus's perspective, I think, on this is that we exist as platypus in a division of labor. So we think there are plenty of talented and smart organizers on the left who have far more experience than I do personally, but than many of our members do. And some of our members have experience, but some of them don't. And who are working really hard. And I don't know that I could come up with, off the top of my head, any better action that they should be doing. However, it is the case that socialist politics have not precipitated in the United States. They just haven't. In fact, I mean, we could argue that, you know, as big as the DSA is, it's nothing compared to the anti-war movement. It's nothing compared to what came earlier in the 20th century. Obviously, there is some sort of obstacle, right, to constituting emancipatory socialist politics in the United States. And Platypus wants to deal with that obstacle. And so kind of our idea is that perhaps the obstacle is actually found in the left itself. Since it is the left that's trying to change the world, since it's the left that has taken on the responsibility of transforming society, then it is the left that succeeds or fails in that endeavor, and it is the left that either facilitates that or blocks that process, right? Is itself the obstacle. And so the question, what is the DSA? Has to do with, I think, this goal of socialism for us. And so we think, you know, we need to, existing in this division of labor, we should ask that question. We should pose that question to the left. What is the DSA? Is it an organization that is furthering its own ultimate goal, which is socialism, or is it not? Or is it an obstacle to that? And so, you know, my kind of argument is that, well, actually, it's acting as an obstacle to that. Why? By taking the energies. You know, we had a panel recently with a member of YDSA on it the other day, actually, that I organized called What is Socialism? And I asked him, Adrian, okay, so is the DSA helping to make socialism? And he said, we're taking the social democratic energies of the 2016 election and we're using it to run socialist politicians, to which one of the other panelists responded, socialist politicians, what are you talking about? You know, they got into a bit of an argument. But
And
the DSA is taking that like energy, and so we have to ask, what is it doing with this energy? And, you know, what can we learn? Is there any possibility that can actually come out of this or not?
I think I saw your hand up second, the red.
Okay. I'm really appreciating this, the question that is posed. If that's all Platypus does, raise the questions and start arguments, then I'm a big fan, which I am. At the end of his talk, Jack was raising the question of whether DSA can develop its organizational structure in such a way that it will radicalize. Did I understand?
Yeah, that. I was starting to get into it.
You may want to develop that, but first I want to put some other thoughts down. I'm in the SP. I was in DSA. I didn't have the foresight to predict what happened, so I left the DSA and joined the SP, and I was in the SWP decades ago. The SWP is identified with or was to it existed with the Third International and the Fourth International. Are people here familiar with these things? First, Second, Third, Fourth International. Okay, so I'm hoping we can have some discussion of that. Big thing is DSA left the Second International, was a couple of years ago, by a big majority, and had been discussing that for some time. So one question is like, where should we go? Where will DSA go? Where should DSA go if we care, which I do? And where should we go? Where are we going? Are we going to a third party? I think DSA is going to find out that the Democratic Party orientation is not going to work. In fact, we saw the Richmond speaker, who, as I understand,
Sorry, can we keep it concise, please, for the sake of time?
Are we going to a fifth international? Are we going to undo the split of 1919, which I'm in favor of? Are we going to undo the split of the destruction of the first international? That is the split of anarchism and socialism.
Jack?
Just some questions.
Split of 1914, by the way.
If you wish.
Okay.
So is the question about where is like the American left going in terms of like forming alliances internationally? Is
Okay.
well, is that what you're
DSA.
DSA? I mean, I'm not personally engaged in like heading out and meeting people internationally, but I know there are members that have been, like Dan Labat's was recently in Latin America. Bhaskar Sankara was in Brazil. There's been a lot of communication between DSA and Momentum and like the British Labour Party. What this will all lead to, and also a lot of discussion with Podemos in Spain. Where this will all lead to, I don't know. And the question of what they do internationally poses a massive challenge because the question that no one really ever wants to talk about on the left, on the right, and the center really seems to be China. And how do we build a real left in China, a power that is emerging beyond the capacity, like they're developing hegemony and they're really washing the United States in foreign policy, which, I mean, I'm happy to see the U.S. fail in any capacity. But we can't talk about an internationalist left if we're not dealing with the largest growing economy in the world. And I think that's something that we need to engage with. I don't have the answer. If anyone else wants to take up the question.
You were the third person I saw. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get everybody.
Well, first let me just say that agreeing with Jim, I found the remarks from the Platypus panelists very, very odd indeed. I don't think there's any understanding of Marx's concept of Bonapartism. In general, I find Platypus to be formulating a form of cynicism on the left that has very little to do with Marxism as I understand it. But anyway, my question is not directed to Platypus. I just wanted to make clear that I don't think it has much to do with this discussion. I find that the growth of the DSA is a very positive development that's happened in recent years. And it is, I believe, an organization in flux. So the question, what is the DSA, is a little bit of a strange question. Maybe it would have been better to ask, where is the DSA going? And that's kind of open at this moment, I think. But I would suggest that the key issue that DSA has to deal with is their relationship to the Democratic Party. There is nothing more significant than that. The Democratic Party has been the burial ground for all left movements for the last century. And any conception that it's possible to work within the framework of Democratic Party politics is really a signature of death for a left movement. So I don't know the inside of what's going on in discussions in the DSA, but I'm hoping that there is a movement, to, at least a recognition that there has to be a break from the Democratic Party, and there has to be some kind of a movement toward a new party representing the interests of the working class and the middle class, and a fight for socialism that's independent of the two capitalist parties. So I'd like to hear Jim and maybe you comment on that.
Okay. Well, I mean, I agree with you. The question is, what strategy? And DSA now has disavowed the project of trying to align or reform the Democratic Party. But the question is, what is their strategy for doing so? And as far as I can tell, they have put forward none whatsoever. They simply they are involved. They say they want to engage with liberals. That there's a multitude of sins that can be concealed by that word "engage with." Clearly, if they have renounced, as Sankara, for instance, and many in DSA have, the idea of trying to Harrington's old idea of trying to realign the Democratic Party and move it to the left, they have to confront the fact that most of the so-called progressive candidates that are running as Democrats today, and whom they support, and whom they endorse, do have precisely that goal, to realign the Democratic Party, to stage some kind of takeover of the Democratic Party by its left progressive forces, an objective that I deem impossible. They're fighting back, and they have a lot of resources to do so. That is the Democratic Party establishments. You can't ignore the tensions that are developing within the Democratic Party between its right and left wings. They are real. They are not phony. But you have to begin thinking along the lines of how you are going to begin to prize people away from this unity with the Democratic establishment that always prevails in the end, and that always sucks as progressive candidates in at the end. And as far as I can tell, DSA or Jacobin has put forward no strategy. They just say, continue to support outside candidates and inside candidates, inside, outside candidates. In other words, it's simply a statement of what the left is already doing. And in the absence of that, it's very hard to discern any clear political direction.
I guess my response to that is, I absolutely don't believe that we could transform the Democratic Party. It is controlled by financial capital. But at the same time, in the United States, you need to engage in electoral politics for people to take you seriously and on a political level. There can be a process of raising people's consciousness that the Democratic Party will not achieve their interests long term. But I don't think you do that by never at all engaging with the Democrats or using their ballot line, but not giving them any of the resources. So I guess I want to push back slightly that there hasn't been any specific platform put out there. And I think these platforms are based on short-term goals. And then there has to be a long-term strategy that develops, and I think that is happening right now. But the way that we're using the ballot line is that DSA runs the campaigns, we're the canvassers. It tends to be our members who are running, and we control the data. So if those people end up teetering towards the establishment, we will pull all our resources from them. And I think that's the difference between also having a political party, which is, at the end of the day, always geared towards electoral politics and state power, an organization that gets involved in electoral politics for strategic purposes, but also is a place where the general left can summon activist energy, direct actions, and support labor and other struggles on the ground.
Erin, you have a response?
Yeah, can I just ask kind of a question? So it's maybe multi-part, but they're related, I promise. So why not run candidates in the Republican Party? Why not try and show people that the Republican Party or whoever else isn't worth their time? Why not try and get kind of people from that? And then why is it that we as leftists, and ostensibly those who perhaps at least take up socialism or Marxism, are looking for progressive candidates or to be the progressives when historically the progressives were opposed to the socialists in, for example, 1912. Against Eugene Debs' Socialist Party, you had the progressives with Teddy Roosevelt. So I just wanted to ask
In terms of the Republican Party, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that the base of the Republican Party are hard right. I mean, in some ways, literally fascist if you interrogate their political opinions. People who are registered to vote in the Republican Party tend to be petite bourgeois property owners who are over the age of 65 and were never going to turn towards the left. While the Democratic Party establishment is completely corrupted by financial interest, by the media, and other interests of capital, the base of the party is more working class and geared towards and believes in similar things that we do. We do need those people to win. The left is not going to win by converting Sunbelt property owners to socialism. Those people are our enemies. And we have to acknowledge, will there be a few? Perhaps. But that's why you don't run. The Republican Party is the most dangerous political party since at least the Nazi Party, and if not because of its capacity of power, more so. The Democratic Party is also a dangerous political party, but its base is composed of completely different elements than the Republican Party. And I don't think we should be exclusively running on the Democratic Party line. I think there needs to, and we have been and had successful independent candidates as well as running on the Green Party line, and over time, perhaps develop a separate political party.
Very quickly,
yeah.
Erin, and then I have to take another question.
Well, the vast majority of people in every single red state are working class, because the vast majority of people in America are working class. If you go to Texas, Mississippi, wherever, the vast majority of people there are working class. So we're talking about Republicans winning in places where the vast majority of people are working class. So if all sorts of people vote for the Republicans, right? So you can't just say it's property owners, but anyway.
Can I just respond to that briefly?
20 seconds.
Most people in red states don't vote. And also people who are registered voters in the Republican Party and who vote in the primaries have a median wage of $80,000 a year.
How much of this panel is just about electoral politics? Is that the purpose of this? It's like verging on 80%.
You could ask a question.
Yeah, I'd rather shift it.
I think
direction.
the question. Okay, sorry, Doug. I've seen you waving your hand for a while now.
I want to know what the dictatorship of the proletariat is, and whether we want to, if that's how we want to talk about the socialist goal, and what it means to try to achieve state power, and if we think we can get the dictatorship of the proletariat by getting elected. The electoral process could ever get something like that. But also, I do think that's like a phrase that outside left forum would scare the hell out of people. So I just want to know what that is.
So this is a good place to talk about it. Who wants to take that first?
I'll take a shot at it. During the Cold War, the bourgeoisie, at least in the West, won the battle over the meanings of a lot of words. So the dictatorship, and I think this is why it frightens so many people, has come to be associated with one-man rule, one-person rule. And in the meaning of Marx, he harkened back to an older concept, meaning popular dictatorship, meaning a dictatorship of the popular masses, which could be thoroughly democratic and was more democratic than bourgeois democracy. So, we could choose maybe different terminology. And that is not, I don't think, the most important question. The most important question is, do you want to establish the rule of the majority of people who work, who have to sell their labor power? That is the enduring meaning of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is my goal, regardless of what you want to call it. And you see, someone said that the focus of this panel was mainly electoral politics. Somehow it always winds up in that way when you're talking about or to DSA. Can we go ahead?
Okay, so my understanding of the term dictatorship of the proletariat is that the proletariat will seize state power in order to transform the means of production, right? Not just in order to take state
Right.
and run capitalism. But so since that's what we mean, I think that's what we mean by dictatorship of the proletariat, is the seizure of state power in order to transform the base of society. And
To introduce collective ownership, common ownership of the major means of creating wealth. Yes.
But not only that, but yeah. But so the question is, to what extent, I guess, to what extent do we need to start thinking about and talking about with working people that aspect of what political power is about changing the way that they work and what they do to survive, to live, and rather than talking about a laundry list of social ills that arise under capitalism, which we'll try to put a Band-Aid on here and there. And so I guess for you, does the DSA have a vision of this dictatorship that maybe is branded a little differently, but that you think communicates with whether it's middle class or working class members?
I don't think it's developed yet. I think it's in the process of coming about. I think particularly because the base of membership is a lot of young people like myself who are just being introduced into socialist politics and Marxist theory, that we don't have a coherent vision at this point of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I would definitely admit that. And I'm not here to say that DSA is everything right and we're doing things perfectly. I think DSA, what it really represents is a hope and a place, because of its flexible structure, where through engaging in struggle, and not just in the electoral sphere, I think the most important work that we're doing is, for example, right now in Central Brooklyn, we're working to build tenant union organizations so that we could facilitate rent strikes, and then really beyond that level build towards a different concept of what does it mean to own land, and reveal the contradiction and really the absurdity of people paying rent to people who literally do no work. If you live in New York City, it's very clear that your landlord is a piece of shit and doesn't do anything for you. So why are you giving him $1,000 plus every single month? So in these struggles to reveal the true contradictions and absurdities of capitalism, this kind of false sense of scarcity and this this belief that people had that they need to be subordinated to someone who's superior and better than them. As someone who grew up around a lot of people who believe that they're superior to other people by their position in society, it's not true. Most of them are pretty stupid. So I think it's about working to build these counter-hegemonic institutions.
People are discussing this kind of more far-reaching vision of changing the base of society and getting out from under capitalism in the DSA. Is that something people talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the night schools that we've been organizing, that is definitely prevalent within the conversation. Of course, the people who are attracted to that sort of thing tend to be people who think along these more grand terms. They're absolutely people who are engaged just in very focused on the day-to-day activist struggles, and I think that's necessary. I think what gives DSA so many possibilities is this flexible structure that allows people who excel in certain elements of building mass organization, on the ground, people who are great activists and organizers to engage in that work, people who are interested in the broader questions to engage in that work, people who want to do electoral work or union organizing to engage in that work, and all come together. What I envision the DSA becoming is really a facilitation of all the leftist struggles to culminate in developing this ideology through interactions with the masses, through struggle. I guess that's my broad point.
Yes, in the blue.
Yes, I have 2 comments and 2 questions. The comments, I'll go to Erin first. And I admire your earnest studies and in your efforts to deal with how to get a dictatorship of the proletariat. I think that's key to understanding what your goals are as opposed to what it seems like DSA is doing right now. But I would also say that on your issue on democracy, I think I couldn't hear who you said gave you your definition, but I think you have confused what I thought I heard you say was the definition of what a state is that tries to impose its interests by means of violence against the somebody, either be for the majority or the minority. But democracy, we want workers' democracy. That's the goal of our, you can't have socialism without workers' democracy. So I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. For Jack, I wanted to say a couple things. One, until you get rid of that goddamn term left, you're never going to get anywhere. Because left, progressive, that can mean anything. What we want is to organize the workers, the working class. And looking, if you don't look at that, and if that's not your goal, you could be all over the show with 1,000,000 struggles. And it all comes back to what I would ask about, my two questions. Oh yeah, just one quick comment about what
Sorry,
you said.
please
about,
keep things concise. We
okay,
have a lot of
but
people with
everybody
questions.
else, I'm trying to say two things and then two questions that are short. But on the question of the Republican Party, what you said, I'll talk to you after the meeting if necessary, but that's not the definition of who's in the Republican Party. I mean the Republican voters. I come from a family of Republicans, and they're not fascists. They're just, okay. But the next thing is, for the DSA, you said, so you've left the Second International. That's good. But are you still studying why you left? I mean, when you left the Second International, what were the ideological, historic reasons for doing that? Is that being discussed now so that the crimes of the social democracy will not be repeated? That's one. And second, how can you engage in struggles with other groups without having your own program? I would maintain that you're afraid to get a program right now because you're afraid a lot of people would leave and who don't understand what's going on. But without a program, I just can't quite figure out how you can engage in struggles if you don't have a way forward to solve the problems.
Yeah, maybe I'll answer the democracy thing. So I was quoting from Lenin from State and Revolution, and so this is when he's talking about, he's taking some of the works of Engels, and he's talking about, what is democracy and what is the state. And so I think we need to kind of be frank about like what democracy is and what our tools are when we're thinking about the dictatorship of the proletariat. So he makes this point that, of course, when we have socialism, the state will wither away. This also means the withering away of democracy, because democracy is a phenomenon of the state. Like we use the state, to enforce democracy, but it is the subordination of some interest to another interest. And in capitalism, that takes, the form of special bodies of armed men, the state, enforcing that sort of democracy. So that, bourgeois democracy, as we have it in capital, is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And so when we're talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, if it's democratic, it involves subordination of some interest to other interests, right? That's what's happening, is that we're subordinating the interests of the bourgeoisie, of the middle class, of whoever else. We're subordinating that to the proletariat. Why? Because the interest of the proletariat is the interest of free humanity, and it's what can overcome capitalism. Not because they're the most oppressed or because they make the least amount of money, but because that is what can overcome the crisis of capital that leaves us in this, unfree and like really ruthless world. And so what I think how this relates to the DSA is the question of, okay, what does a party do and what is the DSA doing? Because I wanted to take them at face value when they said they wanted to democratize everything and that they're doing democracy. It's like, okay, well, if you're doing democracy, that involves the subordination of some interest to other interests. It involves the subordination of some ideology to other ideology. So how is that actually happening in the DSA? And I think that's where we really kind of run into this like quagmire of, well, okay, so you have all of these different left groups that are entering the DSA trying to get their interests heard, and then you have this really, I think it's been revealed, default Democratic Party orientation because, well, all Republicans are Nazis or whatever, and so the Democratic Party is the better one. That's the rub, is that the Democratic Party is better than the Republican Party, right? That Democratic ideology is better than Republican ideology. And I think that itself is going to, it leaves the working class, the proletarian politics here are a passive object. They're not active in the DSA because what we're really dealing with is different discontents that are trying to adjudicate their relationship to the state, which is what a party would do. They're trying to do it through the DSA. And because this is happening kind of unreflexively, unselfconsciously, it is working against the formation of socialist politics and proletarian politics rather than for it. So what I think, though, that the DSA does show us, and this is why I talked about Bonapartism, right? Because what is Bonapartism? It's the negative image of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's the failure of the dictatorship of the proletariat to be realized in capitalism. It's what, it's all of these interests working to subordinate, proletarian politics. And so I think that's kind of what the DSA shows us, is the necessity of realizing democracy, right, as that sort of subordination through the dictatorship of the proletariat. But I think as long as, we entertain all of these illusions about, well, maybe our interests, our left, our more progressive interests will be realized through the DSA, rather than thinking about how could we make proletarian politics? How could we actually mediate the relationship between these discontents in civil society and the state? How could we actually transform and take state power, right? So that's kind of why I brought up democracy that way.
Jack?
Well, in response to using the term left, when I say left, I mean socialist. I don't mean the broad spectrum, including liberals. I don't consider them part of the left. That's just so I don't repeat the word socialist over and over again. In regards to the Second Internationale, I joined right before that decision was made, and that was made by the delegates at the convention. I voted for people who wanted to leave, and most of their arguments were made based on the fact, the social democratic betrayal, based on the turn towards neoliberalism of most of the parties within the Second Internationale. And what was the other question?
Program.
I don't want to say there is no program. In the short-term program, yes, is very social democratic, and I don't think that is something that will bring about socialism in the long term. That I think it is in some ways, yes, opportunistic, but you have to be opportunistic. If you look back at the history of the Bolshevik Party, or if you want to look back at the history of any party that's achieved state power in any sense, and they ended up all failing. So maybe we should disregard it and then just be left to our sectarian critiques of always saying this is the wrong way to do it, this is the wrong way to do it, rather than actually engaging and working with people. I think the program has to constantly evolve and change. You have to have a program, put it out there, you engage with people, you try to build actual institutions of power, and then through the facilitation of the masses with the leadership in the organization, a program evolves over time to respond to their needs.
Gabe?
Yeah, okay. I just had a quick comment and a question. So the comments actually were in follow-up to the question that was asked earlier, but the questioner left, but about activism and what is platypus related to activism. I just wanted to say that, to echo what Erin said about division of labor on the left, there's this division of labor on the left. Many members of Platypus, not as members of Platypus, just as humans, also engage in activism, but not as Platypus members, but just as people, right? So there's no necessary contradiction there. It's just a question of what Platypus does, which is something that's not that, it's something else. So that's one point. Just wanted to say that. But then question for Jack
Devine.
I wanted to go back to this thing that you said earlier when you were talking about. You kind of mentioned the radical Republicans and how that was this new party in the Civil War, and that was only possible because of the westward expansion of a particular time.
Yeah, historical.
So what is the question about where is the DSA going? You also mentioned that it was there's ambivalence about that. I don't see that as an ambivalent question. I don't think that necessarily says that the DSA is going nowhere, or that the DSA is going into the Democratic Party. I mean, the DSA, you can imagine it going many different ways. Yeah. So that's a real question, right? And so there's just it's related to this question of what would it be, what would independent political party, that's independent working class party be? How would that happen? How do you see that happening? Is that what the left, this left edge of the DSA that wants there to be, that's against working with Democrats, or wants to work outside the Democratic Party? What is the vision of party building? And do you think, just to go back to the statement that you made, that there is that it's not possible because there's no longer westward expansion happening in the United States?
I wonder, I'm a member of DSA, I'm wondering if I can reply real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because, and anyway, I
But it's
apologize.
also for you too, because
Yeah, no, I'll definitely respond.
I apologize for my interruption earlier, but this is kind
Thank
of,
you. We were getting derailed there.
Yeah. But this is kind of about that, and so I mean, my reply is kind of a critique about this whole panel focusing on electoralism and the criticisms of DSA that say, why don't you run as Republicans? Why don't you form another party to put your program forward? It really belies fidelity to the electoral process itself. And so I do think that we're really not sincerely grappling with the fact that so few people vote. The level of class consciousness is atrocious. People are simply not aware of their power. So where I would criticize DSA is it's a multi-tendency org. What does that mean? Why then do their efforts mostly focus on electoralism? How would any socialist organization back up electoral power with the base itself? So there's definitely factions in DSA that want to form another party, but even those need to be criticized, because how are they going to put any sort of program in action when no one's really backing them up? So this whole, it's really easy, and I understand why people attack DSA on electoralism, but people should examine like the whole kind of like their whole affinity for doing that in the first place. I don't really get the focus on electoralism so much. Does that answer it at all, or no?
No. Well, I mean, I think the emphasis on electoralism is like you're building a party to take power, right? Like it's pretty clear. Like the reason you have a party is you run candidates. Otherwise, you could just be an NGO or be like an activist group.
Or you could be in the mountains arming yourself to go.
Right, you could do lots of things.
and
But
get
if you have a
power.
party, you're doing that to run to like that seems to be pretty basic.
I mean, you
premise
build
for me.
socialism in many different ways. You build
Okay.
strong unions.
Okay, right. But so like
You control. You can
Give it.
start from the point of production of the first.
It was direct. Should
All
I
right.
respond?
Um,
Because it was direct.
She's had her
Why
hand
don't
up.
we let
All right, sorry.
Jack respond?
Yeah, just
And
maybe.
speaking of
That's a long time.
electoralism, I got here a few minutes late, so maybe someone has already mentioned the Working Families Party, which now, and we're gonna sigh and say, well, but it started as an effort by, solar DSA members, among others, labor unions in the city, to put pressure on the Democrats by adding a ballot line. But, they've had some electoral victories over recent years. I just wondered what the thoughts are about the possibilities of that growing into something more than it is now.
If I can respond to that, I recall 4 years ago that there was a convention of the Working Families Party. First of all, why is it called the Working Families Party? Is that some gesture towards bourgeois respectability? How about I'm not married. I'm not part of a family. Am I excluded? Why are people? Why this phrase "working families"? Okay, okay, but they voted to endorse Cuomo. They voted to endorse Cuomo specifically after he had refused to raise taxes on the rich in New York. Now, okay. Their policy seems to be, yes, we will try to push progressive politics, but we won't. But we won't even consider breaking with the Democrats. We'll allow them on our ballot line sometimes when they run, and maybe sometimes we'll have an independent ballot line. But they seem to be tethered completely to the Democrats. They do not seem to have been able to break that connection or want to.
Well, at this point, they
I'm
did.
sorry.
Yeah.
I'd like to kind of redirect our conversation by posing a question as the moderator. Thank you to my friend in the back. We are talking about electoralism too much, and I want to get back to talking about politics. So I'd actually like to raise again something that Erin raised that I don't think was fully responded to by this panel. And Erin, correct me if I've misunderstood you, but you raised the possibility the DSA is organizing these middle-class discontents into something that is so easily subordinated to the Democratic Party and progressive liberal reform. And by this, I don't think that you mean middle-class discontents as in the membership are middle-class white boys. I think you mean this in its political character. And I would like for the other members of the panel to respond to this possibility. Do you think this may be the case? Is there a way to actively prevent it? Or do you think this is incorrect, and why do you think that?
I mean, I think it's correct about a certain aspect of the membership. I think there are people who are using the organization as like individual opportunism to raise their personal status in politics. I think that's probably true of every single political organization that has ever existed in human history. I mean, maybe there is a particular problem because we are, we're framing ourselves as this liberatory organization, and that is definitely a problem that we need to deal with. But I think the membership has become increasingly radicalized over time, and I think that aspect of membership is actually losing, maybe not losing power, but not as dominant as they once were. Especially, I mean, prior to the influx of young people, DSA literally was just an arm of the Democratic Party that people were using to, I mean, that really, it really didn't even exist, I don't think. It really wasn't doing anything that was important.
Maybe I could just clarify real quick what I meant. When I say a middle-class interest, progressive democracy is a middle-class interest. It's not people who want, like, necessarily, I mean, certainly there's lots of people who want different, like want BDS or don't. Like, that's another good example. But it's not just people who want, like, their personal fame or their personal hobby horse. Like, progressive democracy, that we want these progressive reforms, that we want, the big capitalists to be forced to be progressive. That is, that we think the Democratic Party is crony and corrupted. That's middle-class interest.
Okay, I see what you mean there. And I mean, yeah, like, is the Medicare for All campaign, does that resemble some aspects of that? Yes, of course. But does that also improve the lives of working class people to give them more time to engage in political activity? Like, people, a lot of the reason that people are so disengaged in this country is because they're working 70 hours a week, and there's no like actual organizations within the workplace that give them any sense of of the collective, of the group. And if they lose their job and they're sick, they will die. So it's easy to talk about how, this is like some progressive middle class. It can also be a revolutionary, a step towards a revolutionary change, towards the, highlighting the contradiction between a liberal society that makes all these proclamations about equality when the reality is clearly the opposite. So I mean, I don't think a campaign is inherently one thing or the other. It's about the framing of it. If you frame it as a stepping stone, as a process, as a struggle against insurance and the entire healthcare capitalist industry in the United States, then it's a completely different thing. Like, this is just like some bad people. If you frame it as like an actual structural factor, then you're creating a much larger conversation.
So then my question would be, is something like the Medicare for All campaign, is it subordinated to the goal of proletarian revolution, of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Or rather, in the DSA, is it an end in itself? Or, worse yet, is proletarian, revolution, is that actually subordinated to these different, middle-class interests? Because I'm not saying you can't use them. Of course, maybe it's a good thing to use these different campaigns, but it's a question of who is leading whom. And that goes outside of electoralism, because he is right that there are lots of parties that were formed when they couldn't be electoral, like the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party is a great example. Of course, they wanted to use it for certain reasons, but really the question, when we're thinking about the party, is, for whom or for what are these people, who's leading and who's following? What are these different things being subordinated to?
Is it who or what ideas?
Sorry, Jim, did you have a response?
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think that electoral politics and revolutionary politics are mutually exclusive, but I think you're right. That you have to have a clear idea of the relationship between the two. And the Bolsheviks were certainly not shy about using electoral politics as a platform for their ideas, but when that opportunity was given to them. And I think the socialists and revolutionaries have always used that. The question is, which comes first? And sometimes, in many situations, the Medicare for all doesn't contradict, extra parliamentary mobilizations. But if you have a reformist mentality, a parliamentary mentality, and put the passing of legislation and the making of deals with other politicians first, then if that is your mode of existence, eventually, and this is what came to happen in German social democracy, you come to regard this as the be-all, end-all of politics, and you can come to regard a revolutionary mobilization, mobilization in the streets, strikes, and that kind of thing, as something that frightens your liberal parliamentary allies, and upsets your reformist apple cart. And we haven't seen that materialize yet in this country in recent years, but it happens. When I was in the 60s, but there were myriad appeals to the anti-war demonstrators that were out in the street doing GI work and doing all these things, and especially during things like the Kennedy and McCarthy campaigns. Don't go too far. Don't do this. You're frightening the liberals. You're spoiling the chances of legislation that we have before the Congress. So. Even though the question is not immediately posed, a revolutionary party, a party that sees itself as a revolutionary party, has to be straight on what comes first.
All right, we're almost out of time, so Doug, I'll take whatever your last question was, and then...
I don't have
Okay, so then you can each make a few closing remarks, maybe 2 or 3 minutes apiece. Jack, we can start with you.
Well, thank you again for everyone for attending and for everyone who put together the event. It was great to get to discuss these issues with everyone. And I mean, it seemed like today kind of yet again, I think what happens when discussing DSA did tend towards this electoralism conversation. And I think that electoralism is definitely can be a problem within DSA. I think sometimes too many resources are diverted in that direction. But at the same time, I don't want to frame the DSA as this inherently reformist force. There are many people within the organization that don't even want to engage in electoral politics. And there are many people that are committing their labor exclusively towards building tenant unions, towards mutual aid campaigns where we're fixing people's brake lights so that they don't get pulled over by the cops as a form of community organizing. That there is a lot of work that is being done, and there's this political education that is spreading throughout the organization. As I mentioned before, I've been part of putting together a night school. This is something that has appeared throughout the country in a bunch of different branches. I think it's also important to consider the decentralized elements or the decentralized structure of the organization puts certain interests in certain regions at the forefront. In certain places, it seems like in Pennsylvania, they are more geared towards electoral politics, and they've had some success. In the South, it's been, from what I've seen, primarily geared towards a lot of anti-fascist organizing that is absolutely necessary, particularly in those areas. So I think to analyze where DSA is going, we have to look at what's going on right now and how in the past year and a half, there's not only been an immense growth in the organization, there's been a radicalization within the organization. And while there are some who are probably within the organization, and I think these people are probably disproportionately in power, directed towards social democratic reformism, there is a true appetite for revolution within the organization, but the work has to be done to ever get to that point. We are nowhere near a ruptural point in our society. There's not enough organization, so we need to meet people where they are, go out, talk to our communities, what are the problems that they're facing, and facilitate like militant organizing, building structures that have the capacity to truly challenge capitalism in the imperial core, which has not come to fruition for really 100 years.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I think that the conclusion that we can draw from this panel is that the DSA is still an organization very much in flux. But I don't think we should make the mistake of thinking that all of the people in DSA and its leadership have the same politics that we kind of heard today from Jack. They don't. The Harringtonite old guard is on the executive. It has its own caucus. It has the Unity Caucus. It is still very prominent in the ranks. I went to a DSA meeting in Brooklyn that was a talk by Frances Fox Piven, who is, I understand, on its national board. She has been around for a long time in politics. She was asked, she has, during the Obama years, when Tariq Ali, for instance, was attacking Obama, she was out there defending Obama's reputation. At this particular forum, when someone said, well, the progressives were being edged out because Tom Perez was put in as Democratic National Chairman instead of, what's his name?
Keith Ellison.
Yes, Keith Ellison. She says, "Well, isn't Perez a progressive too?" She has published this article in The Nation saying, entitled "Why the Democrats and Socialists Need Each Other." You have this guy called Joseph Schwartz. He was a confrere of Michael Harrington, follower of Michael Harrington throughout his whole career. So, I mean, that is a definite weight within the DSA, which people should not be deceived by because we have young members who kind of talk like Jack does. There are a lot of people who don't have that perspective. With that said, I would say it would be folly but to ignore the kind of people like Jack, to ignore the kind of people who have come into DSA and who genuinely wanted to be something more than what it was, and to try to promulgate platforms and strategies which inevitably have to involve a split in the organization from the other kind of people that I was talking about. The unity of people who have such diametrically opposed perspectives cannot stand.
Thank you.
When it comes to parliamentarism and base building, what I'd say is that neither are in themselves like the problem. The question is like, what are they organized for? As in, plenty of base building or being in the streets is an excuse not to, to subordinate proletarian politics, the dictatorship of the proletariat, to other interests, just as much as parliamentarism often is. And so the question for me is, what constitutes the party, or what constitutes this organization? What is it that brings everybody together? For the Marxist Party, it was the dictatorship of the proletariat. For the DSA, it seems to be in flux. What does that mean? It means that there's lots of interests. There's lots of different rackets. Anybody could take it. And the value of that is that really it's just the raw power grab. That's like all that's left. Like anybody who's going to be able to actually organize to make the raw power grab in the DSA or in politics in general amongst these rackets is going to be able to do something with that. But will they? Will anybody do that with the constitutive goal of the dictatorship of the proletariat? No, not as long as we have all of these different kind of illusions about what the DSA might offer, and not as long as really the entire left is not interested in organizing a party for the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you for everyone who attended.